It is possible that this was terrorist related, but we don't know. It's also possible that this was workplace related. What I can assure the American people is we're going to get to the bottom of this, and that we are going to be vigilant, as we always are, in getting the facts before we issue any decisive judgments in terms of how this occurred.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Steve Malzberg Show from our New York City studios. That was the president today in the Oval Office. He never gets the facts before he offers judgment, whether it's Trayvon Martin, whether it's Michael Brown, whether it was the police in Cambridge. Doesn't matter. Now all of a sudden he's interested in facts. And if you look at the facts of this shooting, we now know that according to reports, the shooter, the male shooter of the husband and wife team, was radicalized by people who were suspected of being terrorists. He traveled to Pakistan, he traveled to Saudi Arabia, and he had a bomb factory in his house, IED factory. Sound like workplace violence to you? Congressman Mike Pompeo joins us momentarily, but first, here's what the FBI agent in charge of this investigation had to say today.
Again, it would be irresponsible and premature of me to call this terrorism. The FBI defines terrorism very specifically, and we are still, that is the big question for us, is what is the motivation for this? First and foremost, the integrity of this investigation, again, is paramount. Secondly, it's ultimately to determine the motive and the inspiration for this attack.
All right, when the FBI starts sounding like CNN and MSNBC, that's when I think we have some trouble. Joining me now is Congressman Mike Pompeo, a Republican from the great state of Kansas, member of the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence, and member of the House Select Committee on Benghazi. Congressman, welcome back, sir.
It's great to be with you, Steve.
All right, your reaction, what do you know? What could you tell us? Have you been briefed? Do you know any more? It seems like media reports are telling us a lot more than the president is willing to say and that the FBI is willing to say.
Well, that shouldn't surprise us with respect to the terror threat around the world. The president has always been reluctant and behind and underestimated the true magnitude of that threat. So the fact that the president is reluctant to talk about the risk that this incident was, in fact, a terror attack by jihadists shouldn't surprise anyone. There are still lots of unanswered questions. I don't know the nature of the attack precisely yet, but I think we can all see the beginnings of what's unfolding to look less and less like an incident that isn't somehow connected to the Islamic terrorism that we've seen around the world. Could be wrong, may prove different, but I hope that the FBI will continue to do its work and get us to the right answer quickly and publicly.
I mean, what on earth does it take? We know that he traveled overseas to Pakistan and Saudi Arabia, met his wife in Saudi Arabia. She was here on some kind of fiance visa. This was not spur of the moment. Even the FBI admits that. This attempt to make it some kind of workplace violence. There's nobody who's come forward and said that the guy had any problems at work. I heard CNN say, well, maybe they were making fun of his wife at work. I mean, they had a bomb factory in his house, straight out of the Al-Qaeda or ISIS bomb-making book of how to do it. I mean, when Congressman, I'm sure you're well aware, when the Planned Parenthood shooter, who should rot in hell if he did it, when he was taken into custody, we have a rumor that he mumbled, "No more baby parts." And now we know the motive. But with all we know, they're not willing to give us a motive.
Steve, you've described it perfectly. There is no doubt that when it comes to motives that fall along the liberal narrative, they are perfectly willing to assume them without any facts in hand. And in this case, when we have the facts that you described and a handful of others that clearly point towards something connected to Islamic terrorism, they are going to fight it until every last fact is known and they can't possibly stand it anymore. So, look, there's still things we don't know. We should all just be a little patient to do that, but we should also be fearless in recognizing that this threat is all around us, and we've got to do everything in our power to make sure that attacks of this nature never happen here in the United States.
Would you call this, I mean, if there's no, we have reports that he apparently was radicalized and in touch with known terror subjects, but if there was no directive from ISIS, okay, because like in France, ISIS claimed responsibility, they're not claiming it here, would this be considered domestic terror? How do you classify that?
I wouldn't, Steve. The other thing I wouldn't do that the president does often is he talks about lone wolves. I don't know what a lone wolf is. These folks are always reading, learning, being inspired by, being influenced by, operating under the auspices of others who have radicalized them. And so we ought to acknowledge these connections, know that they're important, and we should resist this temptation. Say this was just some lone person. It is almost never that, and it looks in this instance like there were lots of connections. We need to go flesh them all out.
And I mean, have you had a briefing? Do you know anything that you can't tell us? I mean, you know, there's also reports, one resident of the building where they raided and found the bomb factory, or at least in proximity to it, to that house, said that they saw Muslim men coming and going very often, but they didn't say anything, or he didn't say anything. He didn't report it because he was afraid he'd be called an Islamophobe or a bigot.
I have, Steve, received some information that I can't share with the public, not because it's classified, but because this investigation is still in its very, very early stages, and their law enforcement folks are concerned that it might tip off folks that they're still trying to make sure that they get the story from properly, and so I don't want to upset that. But I think we do begin to see the outlines and patterns that we have seen in terror attacks around the world. So we should continue to search for those and not fight them.
I want to give you Judicial Watch has put out some new State Department emails that they got, from regarding Hillary, and there's a chain that showed she slept late the Saturday after the Benghazi attack and missed a meeting that her staff had been trying to set up about sensitive intelligence issues, including the presidential daily brief, on a day that she was going to speak to and wound up speaking to a slew of foreign leaders. She slept late and missed these meetings. Does that say anything to you?
Well, I mean, I think there's lots of evidence. I would include that Secretary Clinton resisted getting involved in the security issues around the world for the people that worked for her, and handed this matter off to others as if it was somehow beneath her. And we saw that in the testimony that she gave. We've seen it in other emails that are out there as well. This was a Secretary of State whose claim is, hey, those were professionals, but you can't escape leadership. You can delegate authority, Steve, but not responsibility. And she was directly responsible for the security of her folks, and missing meetings and oversleeping is symptomatic of a leader who's failing to take responsibility for those actions of those folks who work with her and for her.
I got another one that's very disturbing. An email from former Ambassador Joe Wilson to Clinton expressed his concern about, quote, Christian dominionists who seek to turn the military into an instrument of their religious zealotry. And when you combine that with an email from Sidney Blumenthal to her saying that about Bo Bergdahl, from the father of Bo Bergdahl, that he anguishes over the Christian paradigm, which he says will never be forgotten in this part of the world. Doesn't that pose a whole new set of problems in the context of what's really going on in this country, in this world, which is Islamic terror?
Steve, we've seen that before from the president's treatment of the Crusades as parallel to what's happening today, now a couple of years back, to his early speaking from 2009 in his first speech in Cairo, where he has consistently placed Christians at the center of the problem, and that is deeply inconsistent with what we see taking place today. You see it with Secretary Clinton's refusal to call this radical Islamic terrorism.
Right.
They simply don't understand that it is possible to believe that there is an enormous problem inside of Islamism today, inside of Islam today, and that these terror attacks are coming from that faith. And they can't understand how you can say that and still say, hey, there's good Muslims. Right. But they want to tell us that this is a tiny number, that this is just a fraction. But we know it's more than that.
Congressman, one more for you real quick. When do you think, based on what you've been briefed on that you can't tell, when do you think we'll hear from the FBI what this was, no matter what they come up with?
So I'm very hopeful that it will be sometime within the next 24 to 48 hours. I think they can complete their task that quickly.
Congressman, thank you so much, sir.
Thank you, Steve.
All right, Congressman Mike Pompeo, ladies and gentlemen. Up next, law professor at UC Berkeley, former Justice Department official John Yoo. Don't go away.